Thank you all for joining today. My name is Sayushka. I am the events manager here at Vuelio. And again, thank you for joining in on how to build authentic connections with Gen Z, hosted by our very own Hollie Parry. Hollie is the Insights content lead at Vuelio, and over the past 4 years, Hollie has had both data analysis and marketing roles within the Insights team, helping to raise awareness of the research and expertise we offer to the PR industry. Over the past 7 years, a large part of Hollie's marketing career has been dedicated to STEM industries, working with several charities across the UK and Canada to make maths and science accessible in marginalized communities. She has brought the value of accessibility to the Insights field, with the hopes to make data analysis less intimidating and enjoyable to everyone. We will be having a Q&A at the end of the session, so please make sure to leave your comments and your questions in the chat box for Hollie, who will be answering them later on. Over to you, Hollie.
Thank you, Sayushka, and apologies to everyone who's dealing with my technical issues right now. My internet is not fantastic, but thank you for the introduction. And yes, as Sayushka said, so today we're going to be going through how to increase your relationships with Gen Z. And again, this is a segment of the wider white paper, a guide to Gen Z engagement that we'll be sending out at the end. So do make sure to check that out as well, because this is only a snippet of the amazing research that the Insights team has done over the past few months. So what we're going to be covering today is a set of 3 sets of research that the Insights team has done, which is a large survey across the comms industry, some media research that we conducted over Gen Z discussions, and then we'll also be looking at some social research as well to measure how the perceptions of Gen Z line up with the online behaviours that we've uncovered as well. We're also looking into the finance sector. So we found that it's a really strong example of how following the general narratives and stereotypes of Gen Z can actually damage your brand, and how the finance sector is one of many where there are lots of nuances and specific details that go against the grain of what Gen Z is represented to be. And the value of doing your own audience analysis to see how your segment of Gen Z behaves. Then we'll also be looking at some behavior and engagement patterns through that social research that I mentioned. So we'll be looking into which media channels are most used by Gen Z versus other generations, and which trends are worth the investment as well, with all of the new B-reels and Mastodons and social media channels of the world. It's hard to know which ones to invest in, so we'll be looking at that as well. The buyer mindset, so what are the biggest influences and barriers to purchasing across Gen Z versus other generations, and some top tips as well from the Insights team going forward. What can PR and comms do with this research to increase your engagement with Gen Z going forward? So starting with the survey research, so just a bit of background on this. We interviewed 55 PR and comms directors to get their opinion on what they thought about engaging with Gen Z. We asked them what their biggest struggles were and what they thought the benefits were that were specific to the generation. And then we also did a sample on Gen Z as well to ask them what they thought about themselves, to see again what the misconceptions are between the industry's opinion of Gen Z and what Gen Z think of themselves. So we've separated it into 2 sets. So we found there are a set of beliefs across the comms industry and what Gen Z think about themselves. And there are some disagreements as well. So again, we'll use these perceptions and we'll line them up with the research of the social research later on as well. So some of the beliefs that we found is that the overall agreement across all generations and between comms directors and Gen Z is that the overarching persona is the social and environmental activists with low monetary drive, which I think is the kind of generalized media narrative that we've all heard a lot about as well. With they're perceived as probably more politically active than other generations. And something that's a huge agreement across both survey sets was that TikTok and Instagram are the most effective platforms for influencing Gen Z. But what was particularly interesting was that it was the same divide across both survey samples. So the comms directors, 60% of them agreed that TikTok was the most effective, and 20% agreed that Instagram was the most effective. And it was the exact same for the Gen Z sample as well. So there's a really strong alignment there. Personal and social values have the most impact on purchasing decisions was the overarching belief, and that the preferred brand attitude is visionary, idealist, and empathetic. But what we found that was quite interesting was that empathy sort of fell last in that list. So whereas there is this narrative that being very empathetic and very understanding of Gen Z struggle should be the overarching attitude, actually being visionary and quite prosperous about the future is considered really valuable as well. And leading what that might look like seems to be of a huge benefit. You may have seen that in the media, and especially in PR and comms publications, there's a big discussion around how Gen Z are becoming less and less brand loyal. And that does seem to be the overarching belief in the industry and for the Gen Z sample as well. So there seems to be an alignment there too, especially with the media. And that the key engagement tactics are short form content, mobile first, and channel specific strategies. And by that, we mean having a strategy per channel that you believe to be effective with Gen Z for your brand. And of all the emerging tech trends, AI personalization, augmented reality, virtual reality, and Web3 were voted as the ones most worth investing in across comms and Gen Z themselves. And a quick sort of generalized look into the future of Gen Z attitudes is that it's considered to be based in ethics and activism with a decreased brand loyalty over time. So again, some of the media narratives that are put out against Gen Z appear to be true in this sense as well. So some disagreements about Gen Z across the generations. So whereas the Gen Z sample said that their decision making was most influenced by social media status as a whole, how well they're performing online, how many followers they have, how much engagement their posts are getting. It was peers and local friend groups that was believed to be the biggest influence for comms directors. So there's some disagreement there. 90% of the Gen Z sample said it's somewhat accurate, that they lack patience and expect instant results, whereas only 45% of other generations actually thought this to be the case, which is quite surprising. It seems as though Gen Z are less optimistic about the future of their patience and instant gratification nature that comes along with short form content. So that's quite an interesting thing to lean into as well in terms of considering whether or not short form is an option for you. It seems as though Gen Z are very much in the pool of our attention spans are only going to continue to get worse. 10% of Gen Z perceive there to be unique challenges in engaging with themselves, whereas 45% of comms industry directors believe that there are significant challenges, and the biggest hurdles that were voted for were attention span and demand for short form content. So again, lining up. 80% of Gen Z think that influencers have strong impact compared to 50% of other generations. We found this quite surprising because there's so much emphasis around influencer culture these days, but it seems as though it's still being driven by Gen Z comms professionals themselves, as opposed to being taken seriously by directors and board members across the comms industry instead, and maybe more impact and more emphasis on influencer culture is still necessary. So there seems to still be a gap there as well. So leaning into the media research that we've done across Gen Z, to give you a little bit of information about this sample. So what we did, the Vuelio Insights team across between the 20th of July and the 18th of October, the team monitored print, broadcast and online news. We measured about 4,000 articles. And we looked at the generalized discussion in relation to Gen Z to see what PR publications and what generalized news publications were saying about relating to Gen Z, connecting with Gen Z, what the biggest problems were, what the stereotypes were. We looked at the biggest labels used against them, and again tried to uncover what some possible misconceptions may be. So to the left here, we have the key discussions chart, and what we found was that overall the relationship between Gen Z and sustainability was the most balanced conversation across general news and industry publications. So both PR and the news themselves consider sustainability to be a pretty important topic for Gen Z, which we probably expected. However, we've also found that labour force and the state of generative AI was also a leading topic for general news. On the other hand, things like luxury retail, short form content, and again, influencer culture seems to be a bigger area of discussion in PR and comms publications as opposed to general news. And the state of labour as well was a much bigger issue for general news than industry publications. To the right here, we have a sentiment chart, which helps us to see how the general news is talking about Gen Z and whether it's more positive or negative versus industry publications. And what we found was that the sentiment towards Gen Z was more optimistic in general news and was often tied to things about how they could be our last hope for the future and how they could save the world. However, industry outlets were 28% more negative, particularly in the realm of connecting with Gen Z and not knowing how sensitive to be in their language and feeling as though it's a brick wall in knowing what the right thing to say is. So there was a lot more negative commentary around the industry and within Gen Z themselves, whereas the general news was more optimistic as a whole for how they can Gen Z can benefit our political system and things like that. So now looking into the case study of the finance sector, again, the reason that we did this was because finance is a really interesting example of how, yes, the overarching opinion in the survey may be that Gen Z are, and the media research may be that Gen Z are sustainability driven, ethically focused, but what we found, and short form led, but what we found in the finance sector is that some of these things, following these general stereotypes, isn't necessarily beneficial for every industry. So we're going to explore some of this data as well to just outline how that plays out. So to the left here, we've got the online interests, and we found that across, just to get a general idea of how it's changed over time, we found that between Gen Z themselves and other generations, it seems to be the case that finance is dipping down as a general interest anyways. So it's about 7th on the chart and considered less valuable than movies, pets, education, society, and sports, whereas for other generations, finance is right there at the top of the online interest chart right now. So there really is a difference in how these things are engaged with across the industry. And what we found is that the overarching persona for Gen Z within the finance sector is hedonist, melancholic, and social, whereas otherwise it's explosive, sentimental, and genial. So there are some real differences in the persona types just from the industry alone. According to research by Wall Street Zen, who we've partnered with as well, we found that 76% of Gen Z learn about personal finance through TikTok. Yeah, 83% have encountered misleading information about personal finance through TikTok and Instagram, which just goes to show that short form content can actually be a risk for some industries, especially in this finance sector. So it seems to be the case that when these snippets of information are put out in these short matters, the lack of context and wider information means that misinformation is growing for Gen Z and their financial literacy, and as a result, that's putting financial brands at risk. And the other generations were 8% more likely to follow financial influencers, like Martin Lewis from Money Saving Expert and Deborah Meaden from Dragon's Den, whereas otherwise Gen Z tended to follow financial speakers that didn't necessarily come from a professional background or have necessarily any financial qualifications, which probably also contributes to the greater risk of misinformation. So it just goes to show here how looking at how your section of Gen Z are engaging with the influencers, what the background of those influencers are, and the rates of misinformation in your demographic of Gen Z is really specific, and how there are some real nuances hidden in there as well. And another huge surprise to us was that to the right here, we can see that financial content is consumed majoritively in pictures, whereas the general opinion is that short form video or video content as a whole seems to reign champion. In the financial sector, actually infographics and pictures really take the lead, like quite significantly. We can see over here. And GIFs and videos are actually much lower on the chart, and that's the case for both generations as well. There's perhaps it's an accessibility matter, but infographics seem to provide a lot more insight than short form content, and is therefore the preferred media output for Gen Z. So looking into the buyer mindset of Gen Z and how it's different, again, we've used the social research with our Pulsar software, which is around 300,000 X profiles based across the UK, just for some insight there. But again, this is in the white paper if you'd like to learn more about the sample. We've looked into how the buyer mindset has changed over generations as well. And what we found is that to the left here, there are some real differences across generations. So in general, Gen Z are less responsive to campaigns. So only 4% are likely to respond to a social media campaign versus 9% of other generations. They're less responsive to targeted ads. Only 9% of Gen Z are likely to respond to targeted ads versus 18% of other generations, so quite a gap there. Leaning into the hedonism personality trait in the last slide, we also found that Gen Z are significantly less frugal. 78% of Gen Z are a lot more likely to make spur-of-the-moment purchases versus 59% of other generations, which also kind of backs up the interest of how finance is at the top of the interest range for other generations, whereas it's a bit lower and below social status for Gen Z. So being more careful around money is less of an importance to Gen Z from what the research that we found. And there's less credit card usage. So 74% of Gen Z are less likely to use a credit card. And that AI is actually leading the financial discussion for Gen Z, and that 1 in 3 Gen Z say that they're more interested in investing because of AI trends and AI generated conversation. And they demonstrate a similar level of online engagement in other areas and in other generations as well. And moving over to the purchasing influences on the right as well, we found that social media takes a overarching influence on Gen Z purchases, whereas friends and family and online ads are slightly less important. And again, brand name is really low on the list, and it's the most polarized difference between Gen Z and other generations, which just goes to back up that conversation earlier about how brand loyalty is only likely going to continue to decline from the research that we found, and that perhaps brand loyalty is less of an important metric if you're looking to measure how well you're connecting with Gen Z, and that perhaps something like influencer impact or something more aligned with the values of Gen Z is maybe a better metric to put in your KPIs than brand loyalty. So some media opportunities that are worth looking at. We took all of this information and again used the X profile data to see which publications Gen Z are engaging with, which publications other non-Gen Zs are engaging with, and where the crossover is as well. So there's, you can see the real media opportunities here and how there's value in still targeting publications that align with all generations, even if you're just targeting Gen Z themselves. So again, using our sample of 300,000 UK-based X profiles, the Vuelio Insights team uncovered which publications are most likely to be engaged with for financial information across Gen Z and across other generations. And one of the strongest findings was that Gen Z tend to gravitate towards more generalized publications, even for specific information. So even though this is a finance study, our prediction is that this likely applies to other specific industries as well. So whilst Gen Z tend to go to This Morning or Cosmo or Elle or Glamour for their financial information, which was quite surprising, other generations tend to go to finance-specific publications, for example, Money Saving Expert and This Is Money and things like that. Which it kind of suggests that Gen Z like to, I guess, stumble across their financial information, and they like to find it in passing organically when they're consuming content that they otherwise enjoy anyway, whereas other generations actively seek it out. And there's some crossover as well. So The Economist, Financial Times, the ones that you'd kind of guess are effective for targeting all generations, but there is value in doing this anyway, even if you're just targeting Gen Z. But the real interesting find here is that Gen Z actually like to go to their favorite magazines, their favorite news anyway for specific information, rather than seeking it out publication by publication, which also kind of feeds into the idea that they like to watch general influencers for their financial content, whereas other generations might seek out things like Martin Lewis or Deborah Meaden or other qualified influencers, again, feeding into the unfortunate increase in misinformation as well. But something to consider when it comes to your brand reputation and the information that you're trying to put out there. So we've had a little look at the share of voice as well, just to demonstrate the kind of research that we can provide when it comes to how Gen Z are engaging with the media publications and how banks are performing in those media publications. Because when you know what your target media list is, knowing where you sit in that against your competitors within those publications is really important for knowing how to place them on your KPIs. So what we found is that using the previous sample of the most engaged finance publications, so the Vuelio Insights team, as I said, measured the traditional and challenger banks across the most influential press publications that were in that Venn diagram over the past 90 days. And in this case, we found that traditional banks mostly refer to those that have a physical presence or one with a license, whereas on the other hand, a challenger bank in this case refers to those are the more contemporary name, those are challenging norms, those that step into the fintech region and try to challenge the norms of established banking giants. So some of the key findings that we found here was that challenger banks had a 34% higher share than traditional banks across Gen Z publications, with Barclays leading the traditional voices and Metro leading the challenger coverage. However, finance publications that deemed influential for all generations, NatWest had the strongest traditional voice and TSB had the strongest challenger share. And we also found that traditional banks maintained a relatively similar volume across all generations and across all generation publications and publications that influenced Gen Z specifically. For example, Metro Bank had a 15% higher coverage in volume than Gen Z press overall. And over this period, the top story for Gen Z was the potential acquisition for Santander. So it just goes to show that even though Gen Z are passively engaging with financial content, they are keeping tabs on important stories when they do come along. So using all of this information and to bring it back to the comms industry as a whole, there are some major takeaways that we can use to apply to our practice going forward to establish some long-term relationships with Gen Z as opposed to catching them at this point in their life. Because this is another point that we found in our research as well, is that something big that comes up is the rebellion against wanting to be fit into a certain persona. Lots of publications and lots of Gen Z writers are actually saying, you know, we're fluid, we're not fit into a box, we change so much at this point in our lives. We're not just one sustainability warrior, we're not just one ethically driven individual, we're going to change over the next 10 years and we want you to keep up with that. Some of that media research and more of those articles are in the white paper as well, if you're interested in reading into that. But some key takeaways that we can look at here is that whilst comms directors believe the most common Gen Z stereotype is the social and environmental activist, our social media research actually shows that hedonist, social and melancholic behaviors are generally the case across finance and beyond, backed up with the tendency to be less frugal than other generations, again leading into the hedonism aspect. Personal and social values have the most impact on purchasing decisions, as opposed to things like family or I'm struggling to think of another example now, but other than things like family or peers, personal and social values are the most important. And that preferred brand attitudes are primarily environmentally, socially and governance conscious, as well as visionary, again with tones of idealism and empathy. And that TikTok and Instagram are the most effective platforms. Short form content comes with a higher reputational risk, as we've noticed for some industries, but that's again worth assessing out for your specific brand. And that Gen Z are 13% less loyal to brands than other generations from the social research that we've uncovered at least, and that's likely to continue to grow as Gen Z's age, meaning that there's truth in the media discussion that there's a lack of loyalists across the generation. And that in the case study on the finance sector, Gen Z preferred to consume the content passively and in otherwise generalized media outlets such as This Morning or Cosmopolitan, whereas other generations actively sought out finance-specific media such as Money Saving Expert and Harvard Business Review. And again, that can be applied to other sectors beyond finance, that perhaps a passive and more organic target media list for what Gen Zs find interesting as a whole is maybe a more effective route than targeting specific publications for your industry. And 7 top tips from the Insights team going forward to continue building authentic connections with Gen Z. The first one is to consider the realistic value of a Gen Z strategy for your brand. So even though we're talking about establishing relationships here with Gen Z specifically, there's not necessarily a need to have a Gen Z strategy for your brand. That's just not necessary for everyone. But there is still value in placing emphasis on how to connect the demographic within your wider strategy, leaning back to the Venn diagram earlier. So those crossover publications that appeal to all generations. Just because they appeal to all generations, it doesn't mean it's less valuable for connecting with Gen Z. It's still as effective of an influence. It just has a wider impact on audiences beyond Gen Z as well. And audience analysis in general is a great way to understand if you need a Gen Z strategy and what publications you may need to target. So learning about your brand influences and nuances. So for example, Gen Z may be seen as sustainability focused and financially tied, but there's also research to suggest that they're less frugal. There's even media discussion right now around how there's a big irony behind how Gen Z are sustainability led, but fast fashion consumption is also higher than ever across the generation. So how do you connect when there's those major discrepancies? And do they offer, and does your brand offer the sought after social status that may be perceived higher value than sustainability or ethics, lining up the influences versus the values of your Gen Z demographic? Number 3 is reconsidering the brand loyalty as a success metric. As we've been saying, it's declining over time, and all evidence points towards this being continuous. So if we're going to understand how dynamic Gen Z is over the next 5 or 10 years, as the demand seems to be as Gen Z writers continue to ask for, leaning towards different success metrics is maybe a better way to measure up how you're connecting with Gen Z. So things like brand advocacy and influence impact may be better alternatives depending on your goals. Number 4 is to assess the trajectories. So letting go of fixed personas, as we've been saying, considering fluidity and evolution of your Gen Z audience. Where are they likely to be over the next 5 years, and how will their needs and barriers change as they get older. And number 5 is to refine your share of voice charts. So measuring your share of voice as a whole is not going to give you an insight into how well you're connecting with Gen Z, of course. But further than that, breaking it down into your target media lists. So once you have an idea of 10 target media lists, it will be really effective for your specific strategy that connects with Gen Z, and then looking at how you and your competitors line up within those 10 target media lists. It can really help you to order your priorities in terms of who you most want to get the attention of. And it can help you to understand if you're reaching the right media in your specific campaign. And number 6 is to second guess the trends. So just because a certain content style or social media platform is all the rage in the comms industry as a whole, it doesn't mean that it is for your brand. For example, we can see that while short form content is the obvious choice for most brands, it can be a huge risk of misinformation for the finance sector. It can be and as a whole can continue to potentially damage your brand reputation if you're trying to be a thought leader in some aspect. Leaning into short form content may not be the best way to get that information across, and that maybe something like infographics may be more effective. So studying how your demographic like to consume their media is also really valuable as well. And the last one is to consider the crossovers. So you may already be engaging with Gen Z relevant media outlets, particularly those ones that cross over in the Venn diagram. But if you are short on time or budget, or you have no real need to segment Gen Z, then consider a representative target media list that incorporates general news and lifestyle publications. So incorporating the Cosmopolitan as much as the Bloomberg can help you to have a slightly more representative media list that targets Gen Z specifically, but also incorporates them into publications that target other generations as well. That is everything from me. I appreciate that I went quite quickly, but again, apologies for the technical difficulties. But I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. So Yushka, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Holly. Truly some interesting and insightful content. We've had loads of questions that have come in, and we'll try to get to all of them, but obviously with time constraints, if we don't, Holly will be sure to answer them after the webinar in our post-webinar email, so please keep them coming through. Firstly, if we're trying to build connections with Gen Z, what would be the value in publications that target all generations?
Sure. Okay. So as we were saying on the last slide, even though there are publications that target all generations, it doesn't decrease the value of those that target Gen Z and other generations. It doesn't decrease the value of how well you've connected with Gen Z, just because it's a Financial Times, for example, a very obvious publication if you were in the finance sector. Just because it targets Gen Z and Gen X, millennials, what have you, it doesn't decrease how effective it is at engaging with Gen Z. It's still effective. It just engages with other demographics as well. It's not a better or worse connection if you were to aim for a Cosmo or an ELD. It's just that the wider scope of the generation that engages with that publication is Gen Z, but the extent to which you engage with them is similar.
Perfect. We do have a few people with their hands up, so if you want to put your questions in the box, that would be amazing. But how can someone test whether short form content is a benefit or a risk?
Yeah, I mean, good question. But again, audience analysis reports as a whole are a really good way to look into that. So I would suggest a few different metrics off the top of my head, knowing firstly if it's even going to be valuable. So looking at that chart earlier that covered pictures, videos, and GIFs, seeing as a whole if video is the most effective way for you to personally engage with, your brand to personally engage with Gen Z for a start, and then understanding whether or not it's a risk. I would perhaps look into the misinformation rate of in your industry. Are you likely to be at risk? Are you trying to put out new information? Perhaps given the conversation around how short form can lack context, considering that potential risk as well. So looking into the misinformation scale around the information that you're putting out for your brand. And looking at your competitors as well, of course, competitor analysis, seeing how seeing if any of your competitors are trialing with short form content and how they have grown as a result, or how their reputation may have been put at risk is another thing. There's just some metrics off the top of my head, but that's just some ways that you can measure the risk. But audience analysis reports as a whole are a really good way to suss out if it's valuable in the first place, and then how your competitors are doing with that style of content, and then what the risks are for you.
Perfect. I think we have time for one more question. So does the passive content consumption apply to other industries?
We don't have the research on that necessarily. We haven't conducted whether or not what the publication engagement is for other industries. We focused on finance specifically because it was such a strong example of how following the stereotypes in the media are not necessarily beneficial for all industries, and how it's worth looking into your specific Gen Z demographic. But given that financial content is quite specific and requires qualified knowledge more often than not, you could presume that if you're in an industry, maybe science or something like that, that requires specific knowledge, that there's a chance that if there's generalized publications that Gen Z engage with that have sections in there specific to your brand, but it's otherwise quite a general publication like a Cosmo or an Elle, then there's a chance that Gen Z might be engaging with those publications more than a new scientist, for example, if we're to pick a science industry, for the information that you're trying to put out there. So considering publications that you may not otherwise associate with your brand may be the case for enhancing your connections with Gen Z and getting your message across to Gen Z.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Holly. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this webinar. Like Holly's mentioned, our upcoming white paper, A Guide to Gen Z Engagement, will be out soon. So please be on the lookout for that. And we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.